So, neither of you guys answered this way, but a very common answer to this question is that we have free will. So God gives us free will, and that's why there's evil in the world. Well, if the answer were that easy, is that we just have free will, and some of us choose evil, is there perhaps more going on? Because Paul talks about principalities and powers that we're at war with in the world,
Well, I love the pastor's illustration of the devil shows up in this small community and goes in and he unties a donkey. And the donkey goes into a field and starts eating the crops. That's the next door neighbor's crops. The farmer's wife sees this donkey in her field eating their crops, and that's their livelihood, so she shoots the donkey. The neighbor sees the lady shoot his donkey, so he shoots the wife. The husband comes home, sees that he shoots her, and back and forth until the farmer's son on the other side is the only one left alive. And he's standing weeping over this mass death and destruction and burned houses, and he turns to the devil and says, "How could you do this?" And the devil says, "All I did was let the donkey loose. The rest of that was your choosing." And so I don't think it's a matter of either or. I think it's a matter of the enemy, those powers and those principalities, they're looking to influence. But within us, there's this built-in bend towards evil that very easily can rear its head and take us in a direction we don't want to go. And so I don't think we can try and separate and say it's rather free will or it's Satan's influence. I think it's, my wife buys the snacks and put them in the drawer, but I go by and eat them. And so it's a provision and a choice. There's both have to happen. And so I think we can't just very easily try and split that hair and say whether it's free will or it's Satan's influence. I think Satan is tempting, and we're easily tempted. I think we easily surrender to that. But the question is, how come God doesn't just kind of slap us on the head and say, "No, I won't let you make that bad choice"? I think that would be. Wouldn't that be easier?
Yeah. I think Jesus gives us a model, right, for what to do when we're tempted, because Satan tempted him, and he quoted scripture back at him.
Well, and he also gives us a model of how to deal with free will, because Judas chose to betray him, and he washed his feet.
Yeah.
After he had already agreed to betray him, he washed his feet.
He knew it before he chose Judas.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're giving you a chance to jump in.
Y'all are making all the good points, and I'm just kind of listening and learning. But I would say that along the lines of the free will versus what is it, when I try to explain it to others, I don't necessarily love using it's free will as the reason bad things happen as the explanation, because I just don't think it explains enough, because no one in their free will chooses to have brain cancer. That's something that happens to kids, and we go, well, why did that happen to that kid? That kid did nothing to deserve it. And that's why I resort back to the sin. The sin is a result of free will, but if you look at God's creation, God creates a perfect creation in Genesis, and at the introduction of sin, it begins to devolve, and it gets worse and worse. It wanes and wanes. As Scripture says, things continue to get worse and worse. You could probably even see it in the genetics if you really started looking at it that way. Man lives for so long because he's still coming from that perfection, is my opinion of that. And you start seeing the years just slowly decrease. As time goes on, we see more sickness now than in other times. We see more genetic defects, and everybody has a food allergy, and these things probably didn't exist. And so I think that's all science that proves that the world is just getting worse because of the introduction of sin. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's a good segue into what we're going to talk about next. But there's that passage where Jesus and the disciples come upon the handicapped man, and the disciples are like, was this his sin or was it his parents' sin that caused this? And he said it was neither his parents or his, it was for the glory of God that this happened. And I can look at the worst thing that ever happened to me, which was my daughter dying, and see how that event led to God being glorified more in what happened following it. So the question is, do bad things sometimes happen to Christians for the glory of God?
I think the answer is yes. I think not only does God send the storm, and sometimes the storm consumes the Christian, because I think He sends knowing that the Christian will succumb to the storm. He'll still send the storm, because our job is pretty simple. Our job is to point the way to Christ, and if you can die in a faithful manner, you can give a great testimony to those who are watching. And so we have to get, I started here, so I'm back around to where I started, but I think we're just too egocentrical about our view of faith. I'm so important, why would God let bad things happen to me? My testimony, my light is the important thing. And if I have to face death for that answer to come, then I face death. I've told the story several times. My dad loved Vassar Church. It's a church that he helped build physically. He invested. He would get off work and he would go there and work until late at night, doing woodwork and sheetrock work, trying to help that church turn in old Stuckey's. I don't even know if they have Stuckey's around here. Okay, old Stuckey's into a church, and he prayed for that church, and he would get up early and go pray in the parking lot of that church on his way to work, that God would fill that church. The first time they opened the doors into their overflow was during his funeral. Wow. And you look at that and go, well, yeah, God wouldn't let him die just to fill that church up. It was a passionate prayer of my father's. So you take that and then you expand and say, yeah, but my father smoked his whole life. I mean, the time he was 12. And his cancer was a result of his smoking. God didn't tell him to smoke. We're into that sin and the consequences of it. But even in the midst of that sin and the consequences of sin and bad choices, God does something glorious through a bad thing happening to a good person. Even though the bad thing that happened to them is a consequence of their own choices. Yeah. So it's a combination of seeing God's omnipotence through man's free choice and the consequences of his actions.